Room 307. Chapter 12, The Room That Shouldn't Exist. 4:31 a.m. The second corridor stretched away beyond the open doorway with an unnatural perfection that made Ethan's skin crawl. It was unmistakably part of Alder House Hotel, yet every visible detail appeared untouched by age. The wallpaper carried deep burgundy tones that had long since faded in the corridor behind them. The brass fittings shone with the brilliance of freshly polished metal, and the patterned carpet looked as though no guest had ever stepped upon it. Nothing had been scratched, stained, or worn by decades of use. It was Alder House as it must once have existed, preserved with such impossible precision that Ethan felt less as though he were looking into another section of the building and more as though he were staring through a window into the hotel's own memory. At the far end of that corridor stood a solitary figure, motionless beneath a softly glowing wall lamp. Its back remained turned toward the group, and although the distance made it impossible to distinguish any features, Ethan could see that it wore an old-fashioned hotel uniform. The dark jacket fitted closely around the shoulders, while a row of brass buttons ran neatly down the center. One arm hung at its side. The other appeared to be resting against the door of room 307. Nobody spoke. The silence had become so complete that Ethan could hear the uneven rhythm of Chloe's breathing and the faint movement of fabric as Daniel shifted closer to her. Even Liam, who had repeatedly tried to puncture the terror with nervous jokes, seemed unwilling to disturb whatever fragile boundary separated them from the figure ahead. Daniel was the first to find his voice. "We are all seeing this, aren't we?" he asked quietly, though the question carried no expectation of reassurance. Sophie stared through the doorway without blinking. "Yes," she replied, "and we are." Liam slowly rubbed both hands across his face before letting out a strained laugh. "I have spent the last hour trying to explain everything away. Faulty wiring, hidden passages, carbon monoxide, some elaborate practical joke. I even considered whether we had all been drugged at dinner." He lowered his hands and looked towards the impossible corridor again. "I have officially run out of ideas." For once, Sophie offered no rational alternative. Ethan noticed how tightly she had folded her arms across her chest, not because she was cold, but because she seemed to be physically holding herself together. Throughout the night, she had clung to logic as though it were a lifeline. Every strange event had become a puzzle to examine, every impossibility a problem waiting for the correct explanation. Now, confronted by a corridor belonging to another time and a figure waiting outside a room that did not exist, even she seemed to understand that logic could carry her no further. "I don't think we're looking at another corridor," she said at last. "I think we're looking through one." The receptionist gave the faintest nod, his face pale beneath the amber light. "I believe so." Ethan turned towards him. "You have seen this before?" "No." "Then how do you know?" The receptionist continued staring at the distant figure. "Because I remember fragments." Margaret looked at him carefully. "Fragments of what?" He folded his hands in front of him, and Ethan recognized the gesture as one he had used repeatedly downstairs whenever he was trying to conceal fear. "I remember guests checking in. I remember storms that lasted for days and winters when the road became completely impassable. I remember Christmas decorations hanging in the lobby and children running between the chairs while their parents pretended not to notice. I remember faces, voices, and names, but I can no longer remember which memories belong to me." Nobody interrupted him. His words carried the weary cadence of a confession rehearsed silently for years. "I do not know when I arrived at Alder House," he continued. "I do not know whether I ever had a family. I cannot remember where I lived before I worked here, or whether I ever once walked beyond the front gates. I only remember opening the reception desk each morning, checking the register, and waiting for new guests to arrive." Liam's expression softened. "How long have you actually worked here?" The receptionist looked towards him with a sadness that seemed far older than his face. "I honestly don't know." Those 4 words disturbed Ethan more than anything else the man had said. There was horror in locked rooms, vanishing corridors, and messages appearing on telephones, but the gradual erasure of an entire life felt crueler than all of them. The receptionist had not merely become trapped inside Alder House. He had been reduced to a function within it, another permanent fixture like the desk, the lift, and the guest register. The figure in the distant corridor remained motionless. Ethan stepped closer to the threshold, though he stopped before his shoes touched the polished carpet beyond. His attention moved instinctively away from the figure and towards the architecture surrounding it. The proportions were the first thing he noticed. Unlike the corridor in which they stood, every doorway beyond the threshold occupied exactly the correct amount of space. The windows aligned with the exterior walls. The ceiling height matched the scale of the building. Even the intervals between the lamps and support columns made structural sense. "The proportions are right," he said. Sophie moved beside him. "What do you mean?" "This corridor could exist." Liam glanced around them. "That one can exist, but this one cannot?" "Exactly." Ethan pointed through the doorway. "The room spacing is correct. The windows align with the plans we found downstairs. The support walls are positioned where they should be. The corridor behind us is too long, and its rooms do not fit inside the building's exterior dimensions. But the one we are looking at matches the original structure." Daniel frowned. "So what are you saying?" Ethan turned slowly, studying the corridor behind them with renewed unease. The paintings, the windows reflecting another hallway, and the absent space between rooms 305 and 309 suddenly felt less like distortions and more like imperfect copies. "I think we have been assuming the wrong corridor is impossible," he said. Chloe's voice was barely audible. "You think that one is real?" "I think it was real." Margaret approached the threshold and stared at the wallpaper beyond. For several seconds, she seemed unable to breathe. Then she lifted one trembling hand toward the doorway without crossing it. "It looked exactly like this," she whispered. Sophie remained close beside her. "When you stayed here with Thomas?" Margaret nodded. "The wallpaper was darker then. The carpet looked new. There were flowers on every table downstairs, and the whole place smelled of polish and cigarette smoke." Her eyes remained fixed upon the distant room. "For years I thought my memory had made everything brighter because I had been young. I thought time had softened the details." "It didn't," Ethan said. "No." Margaret's voice cracked. "The hotel changed. I didn't." The figure outside room 307 shifted. The movement was so slight that Ethan initially thought his eyes had deceived him. One shoulder lowered, the head tilted fractionally to one side. Then the hand resting against the door slowly slid down towards the brass handle. Margaret stopped breathing. "Thomas," she whispered. The figure did not react. Liam looked between her and the distant silhouette. "You think that is him?" "I don't know." "You called his name." "I know what I said." Margaret's answer came sharper than intended, but no one blamed her. She pressed one hand against her chest and forced herself to take a slow breath. "He had that posture. He always leaned slightly to one side because he carried his camera bag on the same shoulder." The figure's clothing looked like a hotel uniform, not the clothes of a young photographer, yet the possibility alone transformed Margaret's fear into something more dangerous. Hope. She stepped forwards. Sophie caught her arm before she crossed the threshold. "Wait. If that is Thomas, we don't know what that is." Margaret pulled weakly against her grip. "I have waited 32 years. "I know." "No, you don't." The words echoed along both corridors. Margaret closed her eyes immediately, ashamed of the anger in her voice. But Sophie did not release her. "You're right," Sophie said softly. "I don't know what 32 years feels like. I don't know what it means to spend that long wondering whether somebody you love is dead, lost, or waiting for you somewhere. But I do know that this hotel has manipulated every one of us since we arrived, and I will not let it use your brother to pull you through that doorway before we understand where it leads." Margaret stared at her for several seconds before the strength left her shoulders. "What if this is the only chance I get?" "Then we take it together," Sophie replied, "not blindly." Ethan felt something shift within the group after that. Sophie had not simply stopped Margaret from crossing. She had made a promise to her, and the others seemed to accept it without discussion. Whatever waited inside room 307, none of them would face it alone. The receptionist moved towards the open doorway but stopped several feet behind Ethan. "There were stories," he said. Daniel turned towards him. "What stories?" "Things the staff used to say when they thought Eleanor Alder could not hear them." At the mention of Eleanor's name, the distant figure lowered its hand from the door handle. The receptionist noticed. His voice became quieter. After her son disappeared, Eleanor searched every room in the building. She opened walls, tore up floorboards, and ordered men to excavate sections of the grounds. She hired private detectives, spiritualists, engineers, and doctors. Most stayed only a few days. Some left without accepting payment. "What happened to her son?" Chloe asked. His name was Samuel. The receptionist's expression changed as he spoke the name, as though something buried deep within his memory had briefly surfaced. He was 21 years old, intelligent, restless, and desperate to leave Alder House. He wanted to travel, but Eleanor could not bear the thought of losing him. They argued on the night he disappeared. "What about?" Ethan asked. "I don't remember." "You gotta try." The receptionist closed his eyes. Samuel told her the hotel was not a home. He said it was a prison disguised as one. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. "He went upstairs after the argument," the receptionist continued. "A maid saw him enter room 307. Nobody saw him leave. By morning, the room was empty." Margaret looked towards the distant door. "Just like Thomas." "Yes." Sophie frowned. Why was Samuel staying in a hotel room if he lived here? The receptionist opened his eyes. Room 307 was not originally a guest room. Ethan felt his attention sharpen. "What was it?" "A nursery." Chloe shivered. "Eleanor converted it after Samuel outgrew it," the receptionist explained. "She kept his childhood belongings there. Toys, drawings, books, and clothes he had not worn in years. Even as an adult, he was forbidden from entering without her permission." Liam looked disturbed. "That sounds less like love and more like obsession." Perhaps they had become the same thing to her. The figure in the distant corridor turned its head slightly, though it still did not face them. The receptionist continued. "After Samuel disappeared, Eleanor sealed the room. She told the staff that nobody was to enter, but at night they heard her speaking to someone behind the door. Sometimes they heard Samuel answer." Margaret's eyes widened. "He was alive?" Nobody knew. "Did anyone check?" "Several staff tried. The door would not open for them." Ethan reached instinctively towards his pocket, forgetting for one brief moment that the brass key had vanished. His fingers met only empty fabric. The receptionist saw the movement. The key appeared for Eleanor first. Ethan slowly lowered his hand. "The same key?" "I believe so." "What did she do with it?" "She opened the room." The amber lamps in the second corridor dimmed. Only one remained fully illuminated. The lamp above room 307. The receptionist's voice became almost inaudible. That was when Alder House began to change. A faint noise traveled through the doorway. It sounded like a child laughing somewhere far away, although the sound was distorted by distance and something else Ethan could not identify, as though the laughter were being played through an old recording. The receptionist looked towards the ceiling. Rooms appeared where there had been none. Guests woke in different decades. Staff entered cupboards and emerged from bedrooms. Some people vanished for hours, only to return years older. Others disappeared for years and came back believing only minutes had passed. Margaret gripped Sophie's hand. "Then Thomas could still be alive?" Nobody answered immediately, but the possibility now existed between them. The receptionist gave a reluctant nod. "If room 307 took him rather than killed him, then time may not have moved for him as it did for you." Margaret's face collapsed beneath the weight of that hope. She covered her mouth, and Sophie wrapped both arms around her before she could fall. For 32 years, Margaret had imagined graves, accidents, and unnamed remains. Now the most impossible explanation had become the kindest one. Liam looked away, his jaw tightening. Ethan noticed. "Are you all right?" Liam gave a small shrug. though the movement lacked conviction. Not particularly. For a moment it appeared that he would leave the answer there, but something about the corridor, the waiting figure and Margaret's grief seemed to strip away his usual defenses. "My father died when I was 23, he said. Heart attack. One minute he was complaining about the price of petrol, and the next he was on the kitchen floor." Nobody spoke. "I was in the room when it happened. I called an ambulance, tried CPR, and did everything the operator told me, but he was already gone." Liam stared at the carpet. "For years I kept thinking that if I had noticed sooner, or pressed harder, or done something differently, I might have saved him." Sophie looked towards him with quiet understanding. "That is why you joke." He nodded. "If I stop talking, I start thinking. If I start thinking, I remember." The honesty seemed to surprise even him. Ethan rested a hand briefly upon Liam's shoulder. No dramatic reassurance was necessary. The gesture was enough. Daniel let out a long breath and looked towards Chloe. "I suppose we are confessing things now." Chloe studied him carefully. "What have you not told me?" Daniel's face tightened. "I lost my job 6 weeks ago." The revelation seemed strangely ordinary compared with everything surrounding them, yet the effect upon Chloe was immediate. "You told me you were working from home." "I know. You left the flat every morning." "I sat in cafes and applied for jobs." Her eyes filled with hurt rather than anger. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I had just proposed, and I was terrified you would think I had done it because I was panicking." "Did you?" "No." Daniel stepped closer, though he did not touch her. "I proposed because I love you. I lied because I was ashamed." For several seconds, Chloe said nothing. Then she took his hand. "You idiot." "I know." "You absolute idiot." "I know." She squeezed his fingers. "We were supposed to be a team before we came to this hotel." Daniel looked towards her with exhausted relief. "Are we still?" "Yes," she replied, "but you are going to spend a very long time apologizing if we get out of here." A faint smile moved through the group. It did not erase the fear, but for one brief moment it reminded them why leaving mattered. The distant figure finally turned. Not fully, only enough for the side of its face to catch the light. Margaret made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a sob. The figure was young. Its features remained indistinct, blurred by distance and the strange atmosphere within the second corridor. Yet one detail was unmistakable. A camera hung from a strap around its neck. "Thomas," Margaret whispered. The figure slowly lifted one hand. It did not beckon her forwards. Instead, it pressed one finger against its lips. Then it pointed behind the group. Every person turned. The corridor behind them had changed. Room 305 was gone. Room 309 was gone. The paintings had vanished. At the far end, where the staircase should have been, stood a single polished oak door bearing 3 brass numbers. 307. The group remained trapped between 2 versions of the same room, one ahead, one behind. As Ethan stared at them, the architectural truth finally revealed itself with horrifying clarity. Room 307 was not hidden somewhere inside Alder House Hotel. It was the space surrounding them, folding the building around itself, creating corridors, memories, and entire versions of the hotel whenever it needed somewhere new to open. The room had never been missing. They had already entered it.